Welcome to the Husker247 Podcast. I'm Brian Christopherson. I'm joined by Michael Bruntz, has a backwards hat on, A's hat, I can assume.
Good assumption, yes.
Yeah. Well, it's been busy around here, old Brunsey. I mean, Nebraska adds another commitment on Thursday, a five-star prospect. Former five-star prospect, I should say, in Arik Gilbert, tight end. He's coming by way of Georgia. Started his career at LSU. He was the number 5 rated player overall, correct, in the 24/7 Sports Composite in 2020, which I believe is the highest rated tight end there's been. It'd be hard to top it. Gronk, we didn't have Gronk that high back in the day, I don't think. So
I was laughing because in the list of highest rated recruits ever to Nebraska, Chris Septak's name is always very high on the list, in part because he was right around the dawn of internet recruiting sites, so he gets a lot of credit there. But yeah, I think Arik Gilbert is more highly rated than Chris Septak.
Yeah, well, I didn't even mean that. I think he's the highest rated tight end there's ever been, like coming out of high school.
Oh,
correct?
Yeah. I believe that's true.
But yes, he's the highest rated Husker that's been on the roster as far as what he was as a prep prospect. We're not going to try to overdo it with the hype, though. I mean, you got to recognize the significance of. That's sort of a landmark achievement there, just the fact Nebraska added this guy, especially after the same week they added MJ Sherman from Georgia, who was a highly regarded recruit too. But we kind of got to spin it forward with Arik Gilbert. So I'm going to spin the question to you, Bruns. What's your initial reaction to this one? He didn't play a lot at Georgia, but there's stuff you're figuring out behind the scenes. He was figuring out, and now he's got a fresh start at Nebraska. What do you make of this one and the opportunity for him and what it means for the Huskers?
Yeah, it's a significant commitment. I mean, there's no way around that. And you watch what the player that he was in high school, and I mean, he played in a very high classification in Georgia, and he was head and shoulders above everybody he played against. He's just a freak athlete. He's actually pretty polished as a route runner, I think. That maybe gets lost a little bit with kind of talking about measurables and tools and all that other stuff. But, he brings that to the table. He had a great freshman year at LSU on the field. And then, transferred to Georgia and had kind of an up and down time there. He didn't play in 2021. Had a great spring in 2022 when Georgia had some of its other tight ends out with injury. He had 2 touchdown catches in the Georgia spring game last spring. And then in the fall, it was a little bit hit or miss. He had, one game where he had 2 catches for 16 yards. And a touchdown, and there were a number of road games that he didn't even travel to. I think Nebraska, certainly added a talented player. I just think that there's also, some things that you have to have in place support system wise for him to make sure that transition to Nebraska is a good one. So, just talking on the field stuff, and we'll get into Nebraska's tight end picture too and kind of where that stands. But this is a significant piece that they've added out of the transfer portal. And, I in talking to people who, cover University of Georgia, who cover high school recruiting in Georgia, Arik Gilbert is towards the top of their list for the best prospect that they've ever covered.
And you can tell the people at Georgia really cared about him. I think that's important to note. I mean, Kirby Smart was asked about him a lot because he was such a high-profile recruit. And, they really want him to succeed, I think, and put a lot of measures in place to try to help him too. So that's I think with both the guys Nebraska got from Georgia, I think there's people in Athens who are going to be rooting pretty hard for them to take off, sort of knowing their stories and just wanting to see them succeed as individuals. So that will be interesting. But going back to when Gilbert started at LSU, sometimes people are like, okay, he was number 5 recruit overall. Where's the results? He had 368 yards on 35 catches, and he was facing some double teams right off the bat his first year in college ball. That was the COVID season too, so LSU played only 10 games. So think about that, 368 in 10 games. I mean, we haven't seen that many Husker tight end seasons go above that, actually. I mean, there's been a few recently, but that's a number that a lot of Nebraska tight ends haven't hit. So that's a heck of a number for your first year of college ball when you're playing all the time. So there definitely is a high end of potential there. You also have to think, Bruntz, that don't you think Nebraska has to like these guys that have at least they've seen that Georgia program and the workings of it up close and like what it takes to be a champion. And obviously they're just surrounded by dogs. I mean, you talk about guys who can ball. I mean, everybody there, they only had like 3 or 4 3-stars in one of their classes recently. Everybody else was a 4 or 5-star. So I have to think Nebraska likes that they come from that Kirby Smart culture, and they know what hard work looks like already.
Yeah, I mean, I always think back, like when Nebraska was playing SEC teams in bowl games regularly. You'd go to sometimes you'd go to like a Georgia practice or a South Carolina practice when they kind of had it rolling a little bit, and you you went from Nebraska's practice to like an SEC team practice, and it was like you were on like another planet. Like
Yeah.
the offensive and defensive linemen are bigger, the wide receivers are bigger and faster, and those are the types of players that Gilbert and Sherman have the ability to be. And those are the guys that they had to go up against every day in practice. Those were the guys that they were competing with on the depth chart for snaps and reps and trying to get on the field. And, it feels like this week there's kind of been this realization of looking at what Nebraska's transfer list in is going to be this year, and it's a lot of Power 5 programs. And I think it really helps when you're adding guys that come from a winning culture like Georgia has, and that they know what the work it takes, they know what they have to do, and in both situations, I mean, I think it's I mean, it's kind of remarkable when you have the number 5 overall recruit in the country who was, third or fourth at best on the depth chart, and a guy like MJ Sherman who, was one spot away from being a 5-star on the 24/7 Sports composite rankings, essentially be a special teams player. So, I think, Matt Rhule is very in tune with culture and the guys that he's bringing into his locker room. And right now, there's really not a better place that you can draw from than the University of Georgia and what they're doing down there right now.
Yeah, Nebraska did their due diligence, in checking out those players from Georgia. And also, I mean, one of the things you have to say that's already stocked up here in Lincoln is, and I'm sure people in Georgia appreciate this because they want to see these guys succeed, is there is all the support system and the resources for a guy to possibly have success that can help a player as he kind of hits the reset button and starts over. So, hopefully that takes off more for the person than the player, but obviously both would be great if they happen for Nebraska. You were talking though about where Nebraska's got in their portal guys, 10 of them so far. Just real quick. Okay, so 2 from Georgia, 3 from Florida, 1 from Baylor and Fleeks, Virginia, Arizona State, Texas A&M, Georgia Tech. That's a different look, Brunson, portals pass, and I'm not knocking. I mean, Nebraska snagged some good guys like Toure and various guys who weren't from like Power 5 programs, but that's a different makeup than we've seen in the past years.
Yeah, I think that helps. I mean, I think it does when you're coming from, those types of programs. And my sense with a lot of those guys too is it's just, you run into a lot of depth chart issues. I know with MJ Sherman, it was basically, this is where you are in the depth chart. I think he wanted to, all things equal, he would still be at Georgia right now. But they basically said, we're bringing these guys in. This is what your role is going to be. Stay or go. And he left. And, I think that's the case with a lot of these guys is it's just more opportunity, maybe a different fit the second time around than maybe what they had. So, the one thing that I think you can kind of count on is just how competitive the spring is going to be. With these guys coming in, you've got 35 total new scholarship guys as of right now, and that number is going to grow. So the spring and fall camp is going to be really fascinating to see how everything shakes out with depth chart decisions and things like that.
That can lead us into our next topic because you could take the tight end position alone as just a sidebar, and it's a pretty good one. I mean, it's like how that's going to shake out, because when you think about it, Nebraska now has the top-rated tight end in the country from the 2020 class in Arik Gilbert, the top-rated tight end in the country from the 21 class in Thomas Fidone, and then there's just sort of these interesting guys who have sort of been on the cusp of maybe playing more. I mean, Nate Borkercher did play more. He's like actually one of your more experienced guys. Chris Hickman's still around. He's been a veteran. Then there's like AJ Rollins, who you'd kind of hear about from Sean Beckton last year as maybe being near something, but we didn't see him a lot. James Carney, there's some walk-ons. It's an interesting room. And then you factor in that Bob Wager's taken over, a guy who's been a head coach so long in the Texas prep scene. Kind of from a distance, I kind of like that. You get a guy in that room who's had to be in charge of a full squad down in Texas of 100 guys. Like I could see where that could be useful as he sort of navigates that room.
Yeah, and it's I know in the past that tight ends haven't had a huge piece in Matt Rhule's offenses. But I think when you look at what Marcus Satterfield has done with tight ends, I think he's been a little bit creative with them. And, when you hear him talk a little bit more about, I mean, he says pro style, but I'm not thinking like, West Coast offense, that kind of stuff. But it feels like there's a place in this offense for, tight ends with kind of different skill sets. I mean, with just Gilbert and Fidone, you've got two guys that are, kind of different styles of tight end and different bodies. They look different. And, I think you can kind of mix and match and find some mismatches in opposing defenses with those two guys if they're, playing the way that, you would expect them to. Obviously, Fidone, with his injury history, we haven't seen much of it all. And so I think there's a little bit of intrigue. You're right there. I mean, you need a little bit more of the young depth to kind of rise up. You need some development from Rollins. He was a guy, you mentioned him, that, we heard a little bit about. He traveled, I think, late in the year to a number of road games. So I think he would probably be considered the next up of whatever that group is, the next group. You got Chase Androff, who's a little bit of a bigger body in that room too. So there's some clay to work with there. We'll talk a little bit about it later, but I mean, they're bringing in another kind of flex hybrid tight end for a visit this weekend, and Ismail Smith Flores. But I mean, it feels like when you and I had talked previously, tight end was kind of a big concern. I mean, what does the addition of Gilbert kind of do to your thinking in terms of where the concern level is now?
Well, I mean, if things are sorted out and he feels ready to roll, on the field for Nebraska by the time the fall shows up and gets all the practices in, his talent immediately changes the look of that thing in a hurry, like where you feel a lot better. I mean, I keep going back to that first year at LSU. This guy can obviously play when he's involved in everything within the program. And so, he took a year away from the game, a fall away from the game in 21. So he's kind of been coming back from that and working some things out. But if that happens, there's no reason why he can't succeed, just because he's basically, and I said we would avoid the hype, but this is this is true when you talk about it. He's basically like a defensive end who can run like a receiver. And it's like sort of, this will be hype here. Remember when we were watching a Friday Night Lights and Micah Parsons decided, hey.
Oh, man. Yep. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying, like, you understand, like, we're talking about that type of prospect, like as a body type, and not that he's Micah Parsons and all this. But Micah Parsons, a defender, decides I'm going to run some routes against a 4-star DB, and he goes and burns him for a touchdown. And I thought of that image, like with Arik Gilbert, just like a guy who's actually got a frame where he could be something else, or you would, in most cases, put him in this category as a player. And he's actually a dude that linebackers have to try to cover in space at 6'5", 248. That's pretty good if everything's working, like, so there's a lot to like there as far as the football part. I'm just as excited, honestly, to see what happens with Fedone. Like, I want to see a full runway into a season. Obviously he does too, where he doesn't get injured. And, it always seemed like he was right on the fringe of doing something when those injuries would pop up, judging by coach's comments. And he has stayed engaged. And I think all those guys in that room have to be sort of excited, like, hey, the door is swinging wide open. Even with this new addition, we're going to need 2, 3, 4 of you guys, is what a coach is going to say. And there's going to be big opportunity for somebody.
Yeah, I mean, and it's even, not even an inline tight end. I mean, I could foresee, H-back type roles for some of those guys, moving them around formations. I know with Smith Flores, he's told me that, that's kind of how they see him fitting. And I think you can kind of extrapolate that out to kind of how the tight ends in general are going to work. But it's, not going to be the typical, lumbering type tight end. They're going to try to get mismatches with those athletic guys on the edge. But yeah, I mean, it's the tight end position is always interesting to me at Nebraska, because it always feels like, it's being set up to be used and have success, and guys are dialed in and ready to go, and it never quite lines up. So we'll see if this staff can break that chain of events in recent time.
Yeah. Well, we can now work into, as you mentioned, one of the visitors this weekend has a tight end component to his game. So you want to talk visitors? Should we get into that?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So Nebraska is not done at all yet. There has not been a sleepy day around here, and there still isn't. Let's go through some of the guys we already know. Demetrius Bell is in town. He already did. My favorite thing in Twitter is when guys just put the little red pin down. I'm here.
You should start doing that, like when you just go random places, like Hy-Vee pin.
Yeah.
Like, just make it happen.
Just do it for a full day. Still watching your follower account dwindle.
Yeah.
That would be kind of funny.
Commit to the bid. That's what you got to do.
Yeah. So Demetrius Bell has put the pin down. He's in Lincoln. Jeremiah Charles is another interesting prospect, wide receiver, 6'2", 170, freak athlete. I get Bryce Turner vibes from him. People remember they offered, and Bryce Turner accepted immediately. He was just a track star, could fly, and had all these measurables. You're like, okay, we'll sign him up and we're going to make something out of him. There's a little bit of that with Jeremiah Charles. We'll get more into that. Sua Lafotu. He could help as a defensive end, right? Nose tackle.
Nose
he could
tackle.
be a lot of different things.
Yeah.
Depending on what they played.
Yeah, could be an interior guy. He's got good length, I think, could potentially be on the edge. But yeah, definitely defensive side of the ball there.
He was committed to Washington at one point, but Nebraska has really emerged as a school of intrigue for him. Ismail Smith-Flores, you would consider him a tight end wide receiver hybrid?
Yes, yeah, definitely. Kind of along the Fedoni type. They would be more flexing him out, moving him around, formations, that kind of thing.
And he played for a year for Bob Wager in Arlington, Texas. So there's a lot of familiarity there. Of course, there is with Jeremiah Charles too, from the same place. So there's sort of, I think, a feeling that Nebraska's in a good position with those guys, you'd say, because of that relationship.
It doesn't hurt.
Yeah, it's hard to really work around that.
Yeah.
They also have Jason. What's his last? How do you say Jason's last name?
It's Machachok.
Really?
Yeah.
Machachok. I like that. Jason Machachok. Yeah. I didn't. Yeah. I was not pronouncing it like that. I just called him Jason M. Jason Machachok. Jason M. is also visiting because he's already signed up, ready to roll. But he did not get the chance because of a blizzard that kind of hit blizzard-ish conditions that hit the South Dakota area when he wanted to visit just before early signing day. He's still committed and signed with Nebraska, but he's coming in. He could be an O lineman or D lineman. He's listed as both. He is going to start at offensive lineman. He told me last week, and we did a big feature story on him. And I think if people go to our site and find it, they'll really like what he's about. So where do you want to start with all that? There could be a surprise visitor or two. I'm not going to mention names at this point. We popped one of those names on our site, but that's a possibility or someone to watch. But what has your eye, Bruntz?
Well, the two guys from Arlington, Martin, Smith-Flores, and Charles are interesting to me. I mean, Smith-Flores, he was the guy that, the second Bob Wager was, at least connected to the Nebraska job. It's like, okay, this is a guy that Nebraska is probably going to pursue. They ended up pursuing him. He's got an interesting story. His dad was an All-American defensive lineman at Iowa, and primarily a basketball player. Dad would not let him play football for the longest time. He eventually kind of wore him down his senior year, and goes out for the football team as a wide receiver, just strictly wide out. Has a decent year. His recruitment kind of starts to take off. Iowa offers. Nebraska jumps in after Bob Wager came to Nebraska. He officially visited Rutgers last weekend. He's actually got quite a few connections to the Rutgers program. His cousin, he's got a couple cousins that have played for Rutgers. In fact, one was his official visit host last weekend. But he's still new to football. He admitted to me, I'm incredibly raw. I think that relationship with Wager is going to be really important. He said as much to me when I talked to him. So he would be coming in as a tight end. I think he's got, the frame to add weight. And then his teammate, Jeremiah Charles, kind of a similar situation. New to football. He's been a basketball player. He's does the jumps and track. So has some explosiveness there. Matt Rhule, Bob Wager, and some of Nebraska's staff were actually down to watch a basketball game and offered him afterwards. And Nebraska's pretty much his only offer at this point. I think Bob Wager has a pretty good idea of what Nebraska would be getting with him. A slot wide receiver. I think he would be more kind of a developmental guy given his newness to the game. But I would be very surprised if he's not a Nebraska football commit by the time everything's said and done, just based on how things are lining up right now. But both kind of, Matt Rhule specials in some ways, where it's guys that you can, have the kind of athleticism that this staff covets in those skill position players.
Yeah, and basically a thought of, we're not worried about what anybody else thinks about this. We believe in our eval, and there you go. We have the measurables in front of us, and I think to them it's a huge deal when a guy has like that track time or the jump numbers, and it's just like, the explosiveness is there, and you can teach some of the other factors. Now, obviously, you have to have some degree of like something on film football wise that shows like you're through a couple chapters of the book at least. And Charles had that. I mean, he made some explosive plays in that offense, and sort of for a first year guy, you'd have to say did pretty well. So I think when you look at all these guys that are raw, and they have like, we'll see if he commits, but they have like 3 or 4 guys I can think of already that are like kind of 1-year players. Vincent Carroll Jackson is an example of that on the defensive side of the ball. And if you look at Vincent's first year, though, you'd say, okay, I see it. Like all these guys, there's a glimpse of what's there. It's not just like, blindfold on about their football skills. So I think that's important to note, even though some of these guys are raw, as you say, and will take a little bit of time. One guy I failed to mention in the lead-in was Aaron Hampton, who's also said he's visiting. He's a 24 recruit out of Texas, defensive back. He's pretty interesting because you remember on early signing day, Rhule was just talking about a prospect in Texas. Generally speaking, he didn't say any names or anything. Aaron Hampton, though, took it that it could have been him and was excited about it and tweeted about it. But in any fashion, he definitely has a high level of intrigue in Nebraska, and I think is fresh off an Alabama visit too. So he's Nebraska's going after it. They've got this interesting dynamic, Bruntz, where there's guys like Jeremiah Charles who they're the only offer, and then they're the complete other end of the spectrum where Nebraska is totally going head to head with the biggest dogs in football right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what they've done is especially in the state of Texas. I mean, I think they're aiming a little bit higher there, and I think it's what they've done the last couple of weeks is they've really flooded assistant coaches into Texas. Matt Rhule has spent a ton of time down there. Terrence Knighton's been in Houston. You've had Bob Wager up around Dallas. Garrett McGuire has been getting around now quite a bit, and it's the signal by being there that Texas is going to be really important. And I think given Matt Rhule's connections in the state, the staff's connections down there, I think I've talked to a few recruits down there that are really taking notice of that. And you've got coaches vouching for Rhule and some of his assistants too. And I think that's, you're starting to see more offers to the top 247 guys, those types of guys in Texas. They've been down to see Dylan Raiola twice already in January. Matt Rhule was down there. Marcus Satterfield was down there too. So, yeah, I mean, you're kind of operating in two worlds right now where you're looking for the Bryce Turners and the Jalen Lloyds, the guys that are just, athletic freaks who maybe don't have the stars behind their names. And then you've got the guys that have the stars behind their names that the staff is also going to swing for. So that's the recipe. I mean, I think, as much as people were talking when Matt Rhule came, that it's going to be a lot of, offers to guys you've never heard of and that kind of thing. That's true. But I think they're also willing to leverage the power that kind of comes with Nebraska and that name and the Big End too.
You said the name, so I'm going to ask you about him because you know how like ESPN just are like Dallas Cowboys. They just like, it's like, we'll just talk about Dallas Cowboys. We know we'll get ratings whether people like hearing about it or not. Dylan Raiola is like the name with Nebraska football right now. It's just like put it up there anywhere and people are like, okay, I'm going to read that or I'm going to think about that a little bit. It was interesting. Rhule went right down there last week to Arizona. I think people have kind of thought Georgia could have the upper hand as a favorite right now, but then Dominic Raiola, Dylan's father, tells Steve Wiltfong, it's wide open. We're considering all the options. Obviously, they have a deep connection with Nebraska. What do you think about that right now as you kind of gauge where that one's going?
Yeah, I mean, I think Nebraska is going to be in the mix. I mean, when he decommitted from Ohio State, there's a lot of connections between the Raiola family and Nebraska, and I think Matt Rhule is, going to take his swing. I mean, when you have a connection to the number one player in a class, I mean, it behooves a head coach to play that string out as long as you can. And they're going to take their swing. I think Nebraska feels like they can be competitive in the NIL game with that. And, they're up against Georgia, USC. I think there's some other, big programs that are going to be in that conversation too. But, I think for Matt Rhule, it's going to be, keep pursuing until it's over. And, do I think Nebraska is, close to the lead for him? No, not necessarily, but I think they're more in the mix than they were 6 months ago or last spring. I mean, I think that's certainly true. So, yeah, I mean, we'll see. I mean, but you're right. I mean, he's the number one quarterback, number one recruit in the country, and Matt Rhule is not being shy about Nebraska's interest in him, which, I mean, that's how you have to play it, especially when you're a program that, has been down for as long as Nebraska has.
As I listen to people talk, I don't feel as bad at a press conference that I said, "Hey, Matt Rhule," before I asked the question, because I notice everybody always uses his full name now. So I think it's like in the brain, and that's what happened there. But because everybody's like Matt Rhule.
Yeah,
it's not
it rolls
just
off
Rhule.
the tongue.
Yeah, it does kind of. So that's the excuse for that. People didn't even know that happened. It's still in my head though. But anyway, it is going to be a big weekend ahead for Nebraska. I expect there could be some booms. It feels like it's not slowing down yet. Maybe there'll be a surprise or two. But you're always prepared right now. You don't know necessarily always what the surprise is going to be, Bruntz, but it feels like you kind of wake up like there could be one today. That's sort of what's been happening with Husker football over the last few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of have the smelling salts at the desk. You get ready for the morning and just kind of get to work. I mean, that's where you're at right now.
Smelling salts, huh?
Yeah, just got them in the drawer right here. Just gets you going. It's like it's better than coffee. So, but yeah, I mean that's the way the staff is recruiting. I mean, we'll have ample time to talk about it, but I'm not great at math, but the staff is going to have some work to do to get back to 85.
Yes,
by the time fall camp rolls around, I think they'll get there. They have to get there. So, that'll be fascinating to see. But yeah, I think this weekend, once you get down to the end a little bit, I think you kind of close at a higher percentage if you're bringing guys in this late in the process.
This is probably one of many weak spots in my game, but I'll admit, some people get fired up day to day about the scholarship chart and like following it, like, oh, how are they going to get down there? And I always just think to myself, they'll do it. Like it's not my job to figure out how to do it, but they'll do it. And we'll chronicle it as they do it. But I mean, there's always a thought like, how in the world can they? It'll happen. There's going to be some guys who leave after the spring and stuff like that. Obviously, they have to. Receiver's pretty interesting as we talk. I don't want to get into a whole topic about it, but I mean, as you think about who they've piled up at wide receiver, that's becoming a pretty loaded room in numbers all of a sudden.
Yeah, you've got a nice mix of veteran guys and really young guys. And, even, bringing in a guy like Jeremiah Charles, I mean, you might say, oh, well, they've got, all these young wide receivers that, are going to be battling for snaps and stuff in the spring. And while that's true, you have to keep kind of replenishing the stock. And I would expect that's a position group where you're probably going to lose some of those young guys in the spring. That's just how it shakes out. So, yeah, I mean, I get the hand wringing about scholarship numbers, but I mean, they know what the number is. They know how they got to get, when they got to get there, and it'll happen. It always does.
Yeah, I think they're going to carry 6 QB scholarship guys into the Minnesota game.
It would be a miracle of modern football if somehow they have the entire group, to choose from when they're making that travel roster.
Yeah. Well, we can finish it up here with a little hoops talk.
Yeah.
If that works.
Yeah.
You know what? They pull you back in just when you're like, all right, fine, we'll just go cover recruiting and that'll be that. They go beat Ohio State 63-60 on Wednesday night on a snowy night in Lincoln. Decent crowd for the circumstances. I got to give people props who made it there. It wasn't the usual crowd, but they got fired up after the Hoiberg technical. When he got teed up, they were with Fred on that. They thought the boys were getting jobbed. The fouls were 6-2 at that point. Nebraska had 6 of them. And it was fun I liked seeing Fred I was like, they're going to team up. They're going to do it. Like, like when you see a building and you almost want it to happen.
Yeah.
And Denham Dawson said he liked it too. So that was a nice win. And now they play at Penn State Saturday, then Northwestern at home Tuesday. Those aren't easy games by any means, especially when Juwan Gary's out for the season. But they're 10-9. They're 3-5 in the league. And this is a big, 4 to 5 days for this team. We could say that every time we do this probably, but these are games you could get. And if you somehow were able to squeeze out a couple wins, suddenly, who knows, we're talking big. But what do you think?
Yeah, no, they're big. I mean, Penn State and Northwestern are not the Penn State and Northwestern that you would generally associate with those schools.
They're not.
They're both playing pretty good basketball. You mentioned Gary. They didn't have him against Ohio State. They shook up the starting lineup a little bit. How confident are you in Nebraska's ability to keep it between the ditches with Gary out? Because he was playing good basketball, and that Minnesota game, he made 2 plays that basically helped them win that game. I mean, how does Nebraska make this work without him?
I think it's going to be pretty tough, actually. I mean, I really wish we could watch this team through March with Gary, because I think it could be very interesting if that were the case. Because go back to the Minnesota game just before he got injured, he was the difference why they won that game. He had 18 points, 11 rebounds. He had the putbacks, the one in OT. He's just a junkyard dog, and you can't really easily replace that. You need multiple guys to do it. Now, young Denham Dawson is like a younger Gary. He's coming up, and he can be that type of guy, I think, in time. And he is just an incredible effort guy. I tweeted out, it was the Husker Hoop Central account that tweeted it, give them the credit for it. But there was a play where Denham Dawson gets knocked to the ground, and he runs all the way back. He's completely out of the play just to factor in to contest a shot. And the Buckeye ends up missing it. But that was seriously one of those plays any coach would want to show over and over again to his team of what it's supposed to look like hustle wise. And that's what Denham Dawson's about. And I say all that to lead into this point. The one thing that I appreciated Wednesday night, and I think some Husker fans who follow hoops closely did, is, to me, it moved the needle a little bit. Okay, I see something with Denham and Jamarcus that you can build on. And that's interesting to me. When you give me something where I can say, okay, these guys can be here for another year or 2 or 3 or whatever it's going to be. You never know in college sports anymore, but they're going to be around maybe for a while, and they're showing signs that they can be something. That makes me sit up in my chair a little bit, no matter how the season's going, because then I'm watching guys I feel like are going to, they're going to be here. And that's why last year sucked, honestly, is because you watched a team where you didn't think a bunch of the key guys would necessarily be back. So people were like, what's the point? And I felt like Wednesday was one of those moments when you saw those two guys playing, and even Oleg, where you're like, okay, there's something there maybe.
Yeah, and I think that's in some ways with Nebraska basketball, like you're kind of riding this wave and you're like, we don't want to look too far ahead. We don't want to see what's in the future there. But I mean, that's a question in the back of, I think, a lot of people's minds. I've been asked, on radio shows about this, like what's the build? Like what's the next step? And I think that's an important thing to get figured out here in January and February, regardless of, how things kind of go for Nebraska, is what can you carry into next season, or who is going to be that next step for you, given who they're going to lose. Wilcher came off the bench the other night. Yeah. That spot, the Tominaga Wilcher place, that's where you got to get a little bit of scoring punch to make up for Gary, right?
Yeah, they need
like somebody has to. Yeah,
somebody's got to be able to start hitting some shots from deep. I mean, the fact they won the game on Wednesday was a bit of a stunner because they were so awful in the first half on offense. So was Ohio State, though. But Nebraska shot 30% in the first half. Then they shot 53% in the second half. But if you think about their resume so far, they really haven't had many, or I don't even know if you could say more than one or two games where you've thought like they really had it together on offense for 40 minutes or even like 35 minutes. And that's what needs to start to happen. And it's going to be tough, though, because they just have some guys who are key guys who aren't necessarily known as dead-eye shooters. Like Grissel does a lot of really good things, but that's not necessarily what he's known for. Bandamel the same way. So, yeah, I think Wilcher and Tominaga have to be those guys who that's sort of your role. When those openings are there, they need them to catch fire. If you want hope, Wilcher, Fred Hoiberg pointed this out the other night. He was 33% before New Year's last year from behind the arc. And then after New Year's, he was above 50%. And so he started off cold again this year. So you hope maybe he puts up a sequel to what he did last year in that regard.
All right. So at Penn State, Northwestern, and then they got Illinois on the 31st, right? Am I missing anybody else in there?
No, I think that I'm not looking at it right offhand, but I know those are the next two. And then I think you're right with Illinois. I mean, Nebraska's 3-5 in the league, but 3 of those losses are to the teams that take up the top 2 spaces in the standings right now. I mean, 2 were to Purdue and then 1 to Michigan State. And then Illinois, who some people were saying until last night was the most talented team in the league. And then Nebraska lost to them. And the team Illinois got beat by, Indiana, is who Nebraska lost to. So, I mean, it has been quality, if you want to use that word, quality losses that is on Nebraska's resume. It's too bad, frankly, they don't have that Purdue one in Lincoln, because if they had that one in their pocket and we're 11-8 right now and 4-4 in the league and had beaten Purdue, I don't know. You would hear a little bit more whispering about stuff. But right now it's about, can they kind of keep it above 500 and give you a shot at the postseason and see those young guys grow? Yeah. Just that's the biggest thing really in the big picture.
Yeah, you'd be looking at things a little bit differently if you had a home win over Purdue. You beat Creighton. You've already got Iowa at home too. So,
and Iowa's played pretty well since that game.
They picked it up.
Yeah, so that's a nice win for Nebraska. But we'll see. I mean, the thing they haven't done well, as we'll finish it off here, is they haven't followed up success in a great fashion this season. So we'll see if they can do that at Penn State, who, as you mentioned, is not like a bad team. I mean, sometimes we get these. I know, Rutgers used to be thought of that way. Now people are smart enough to know Rutgers is a freaking bulldog to take on.
Yep.
So we'll see what happens Saturday. We'll see if they can go on the road and steal one. But it'll be a busy weekend regardless. We'll have coverage of that game, but certainly all the recruiting stuff. It's just going to keep going for a while, and that's fine with us. Anything else to say, Bruntz? Are you all good?
I'm good. I'm talked out. Get us out
I'm
of
all
here.
talked out too. So with that, we encourage you to come to Husker 247 for all the latest. There will be plenty on there.